Okay, so first of all, let me just divide up what I'm planning on doing for you guys. But to start off, I'm going to give you a little bit of a historical exposition, then we're going to talk a little bit about the theological issues and how they have ramifications for contemporary operations. But one thing that I'd like for you to do is, because of course I don't really know you guys, and so I wanted to make sure that if I use terms or concepts that you don't understand, somebody please say so. This would be extremely helpful for me because obviously I don't know what you don't know. And so definitely that's something that American audiences would do. So I'm kind of hoping that you will extend the same courtesy to me as well. And at the very end then we will have some time for questions and answers. So let's just go over some of the material in the chapter that I had sent to you guys and just summarize it so that everything's out on the floor. So when we're talking about the term jihad, literally this term means struggle or exertion. It's a euphemism that we can start to find inside the Quran, but it's important to note that from the period of the Quran, which is basically 610 to 632, it isn't the primary word that's associated with violence. And so that sometimes causes confusion to students because they ask, like, what is this inside the Quran? The term jihad does appear inside the Quran, but there are other words that are primarily used for the application of violence. So I'd like to start off with just a primary definition of jihad. Sometimes in the popular media you hear that it's called holy war. I usually refer to it as fighting with God's sanction, or sacral warfare. In other words, warfare that has a sacred connotation to it, rather than using the term holy warfare, which is so closely connected, especially with the Crusades. So that's the terminology that I'm going to be using for this particular lecture. So when we're talking about the sources for jihad, what we have is, first of all, the voluminous hadith literature. Okay, now I'm hoping that you do know what the hadith literature is. So the hadith literature is the traditions that are associated with the life, doings, and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. So that material is collected into authoritative collections about 200 to 250 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death. And each one of those collections usually has a section on jihad. And so it's from those books and booklets that we can start to get a picture of what this warfare is like. Usually it is of a very highly stylized nature. In other words, it starts off with a request for the other side to convert to Islam. There is then a process of fighting, and then there's a manner by which the fighting comes to an end, and then a process by which, for example, spoils are allocated. Different categories of people are seen as inviolate, especially women and children, monks, old people, and so forth are usually considered to be not subjects for being killed or targeted. Now, I'm talking about the classical material here, so we'll soon get to the contemporary material and see how Salafi Jihadis manipulate it. But let's continue on with the classical material. So the backdrop for that classical material is the period that we know as the Great Islamic Conquests. So the Great Islamic Conquests are a period of about 100 years between the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 and approximately 630, 634 or so, during the course of which the Muslims conquer most of the area that is in the southern part of the Mediterranean basin, the area of the classical world, and out into Central Asia. So this is an extraordinary change, and it's one of the great changes of history. Essentially, it heralds the transition of that territory away from Christianity, although that process took a long period of time, and into the civilization that we now call the Arabo-Islamic civilization. Okay, now that civilization is dominated by Islam, but it isn't necessarily entirely Muslim for several hundred years, because it's important to note that the process of actual conversion to Islam lags behind the process of conquering a given area. Okay, so that's probably one of the first points that I'd like to touch upon. I'm frequently asked the question, did Islam spread by the sword? And this is a very interesting question. Usually it's directed in a polemical manner, but I'd like to address it in a serious manner. The fact is, of course, the initial conquests are actually spread by the sword, and almost certainly the ideology behind them is, in fact, the ideology of jihad, or sapphic warfare. But the fact is that conquest of territory did not actually lead immediately to the conversion of all the peoples involved to Islam immediately. For example, especially in the areas of Syria and Egypt, it's those of you, if anybody's been to Egypt, you know that there's a substantial Christian community that survives to this very day, and scholars still debate, as a matter of fact, when exactly Egypt achieved its Muslim majority, which probably wasn't actually for about 700 years after its conquest. Okay, so in other words, there's a serious lag time right there between the periods of conquest and the period of conversion to Islam. Now, other areas in that are now conventionally Muslim were conquered. Certain areas of Africa, for example, were definitely conquered and people forcibly converted. Certain areas, such as Indonesia and Malaysia, were never conquered. And actually, Islam in those areas spread not by the sword, but usually by peaceable conversion. That particular person will be the participant, but some other factors will force the actual issue, usually a hostile government. So, and that particular martyr then will be killed, but not through their own will or volition. In other words, the only thing that is pushing the whole thing forward is the fact that a malevolent force, as I say, usually a government, is trying to coercively force a given believer to change their belief, and that particular personality is resisting. Okay, now that most oftentimes happens in cases when a religion is in a minority. Now, that has not been the historical circumstance of Muslims. With the exception of the first 12 years of the Prophet Muhammad's ministry, in other words, that period between 610 and 622, when the Hijrah happened, the immigration to Medina. So in general, since 622, the trajectory of Islam has been to be a majority, or at least a ruling power inside the world of Islam. And so there have been comparatively few circumstances under which the Muslims have been required to be martyrs in a passive sense. So what is developed inside Islam is what we can call an active martyrdom. Okay, and we start to see that actually inside the text of the Quran where the martyrdom is first mentioned, which is Surah number 3. Okay, that is closely associated with the Prophet Muhammad's major defeat at the Battle of Uhud in 626. So this is a significant defeat, but not an absolute one for the early Muslim community, and a number of important figures close to the Prophet actually are killed during this battle. So the question arises, how exactly should these people be honored or rewarded that would be different from rewards that would be accorded to all Muslims? In other words, if one reads the Quran, one realizes that there are significant rewards that are induced towards Muslims, but those that should be directed towards martyrs should be different. Okay, so needless to say, what I'm getting at is that the traditions about that are actually coming from the Hadith literature. And we find a number of different things that are held out for the martyr. Okay, probably the most important of which is the ability to have intercession for members of their family or friends. Okay, so some of you, I'm sure, don't come from religious backgrounds and stuff, and so you might not understand the significance of the word intercession right there. Okay, so the Arabic word is the word shafa'a, okay, which means basically to have the ability to speak or on somebody's behalf for God, to God. In other words, if hypothetically X person would have gone to hell, then a person having the right of intercession would be able to speak on their behalf and get them into heaven. Okay, now we have to say that in normative Islam, normative mainstream Sunnism, there are some very significant theological questions about shafa'ah, or intercession. In other words, to what extent should it be applied, who can apply it, and so forth, and whether it's even spiritually legitimate. Because essentially shafa'ah is more or less like spiritual bribery. It's using one's own credit in order to extend something to somebody who is significantly not worthy. So, but suffice it to say that on a popular level inside popular Islam, the idea of intercession is extremely popular. And it's very easy to see the reasons why. None of us really want our friends or family to go to hell. And so the ability or willingness of a martyr, for example, to give up their lives on behalf of others could be seen as a significant gain. And we'll see that as we get later on into the contemporary material. Now there's a number of different other rewards that are held out, directly going to heaven, not having to face the different trials and tribulations that happen inside the grave, for example. And probably the one that is best known is the marriage of the martyr to 72 of the women of paradise, known as Houris. Okay, so this is something that oftentimes gets mentioned inside the popular press, and so we'll talk about it at a little bit of a later time. Okay, so these particular rewards are delineated inside the Hadith literature, and they come to be part of what we can call kind of the myth that surrounds jihad and martyrdom that gradually develops over that early period. Okay, part of that myth is that when a martyr dies, for example, their body is considered with its wounds to be essentially pure. Okay, most Muslims have to, during the course of the death process, have their bodies washed before they are placed inside the grave. That is not true of the martyr. They are buried as is, with their wounds essentially protecting them in a state of purification. Okay, so there's oftentimes the sense that a martyr is not dead, but has, as it were, been married. Okay, and this is a mythological process that we can see from the very earliest period. We can see scenes of people who go into battle, something like in a liminal state. Sometimes they'll openly divorce their human wives, saying they're moving on to paradise, and so forth. There will oftentimes be dreams that will be associated with this process, dreams of going to heaven, dreams of seeing God, and so forth, that will happen just before the battlefield process. Okay, so this is a part of a mythology that develops during the pre-modern period and continues to have a powerful exertion over the contemporary period. I know I'll wait for questions afterwards, but are there any questions up till now? Before we move on to more kind of like the contemporary stuff about that classical material. Anybody want to throw out anything? Okay, I know I didn't make that much sense, but you're right, I guess I'll just leave it for the moment. Okay, so let's go on to jihad in the contemporary period. Okay, so jihad has a number of different ramifications, and we're going to be talking about it first of all in the broadest sense, and then focus mostly on its Salafi Jihadi manifestation. Okay, so it's important to realize that coming into the modern period, most Arab Muslim countries did not achieve their independence through the process of jihad or sappho fighting. In other words, the people that gained independence usually were secular nationalists who often despised the religious traditions to which they were heir. So jihad wasn't a major factor during the late colonial period or early independence period. It's something that has been fostered to some degree by governments, usually as a result of frustration. Many times, especially by those governments and countries that were close to Israel, as a result of fighting against Israel. Okay, so starting especially after the 1967 war, in which the governments of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria were significantly defeated by Israel, there was a turn towards religious literature and religious themes in order to bolster morale, especially among those countries. And so we find that during that period, they're starting to use more classical themes and so forth. And just to give you an example, the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which is so significant in the histories of Egypt and Syria, was code-named after actually one of the Prophet Muhammad's battles, the Battle of Badr, which was the first Muslim victory. Okay, so there's a lot of mythology use in that particular regard. But the primary developers of the jihad materials are actually those people who we call Salafis. Okay, so Salafism is a theological trend within Sunni Islam, which basically holds to the idea, and I'm going to have to simplify it a little bit here. If you want to read a good book, a good recent book that came out about the whole issue of Salafism, I definitely recommend that of Meir Shiraz on Salafism, which just came out 2 years ago. He really takes care of a lot of the different major themes. Okay, but the most important theme for our purposes is the theme of takfir. Okay, so takfir is a term that is used, it means to label an apparent Muslim to be a non-Muslim. Okay, so Salafism within Sunnism, okay, within the larger belief system of Sunnism, is a development that focuses mainly upon creed. Okay, now some of you, maybe coming from a Christian background, might say, what? Why is creed so important? Okay, so because Christianity tends to be actually a creedal religion, a religion in which we have words like orthodoxy, correct belief. Okay, but traditionally Islam was not an orthodoxy. It was what we call an orthopraxy. In other words, what was emphasized was to do actions rather than necessarily believe correctly. Okay, and I'd like for you to consider the implications of that. Those of you who know something about Islam will recognize the basis of the 5 pillars of Islam. Okay, so does anybody know them? Maybe throw those out. I'll try and get you guys to participate, even if it's late in the evening. So, anybody know any of the 5 pillars of Islam? Before I'm forced to name them all off. Okay, I guess I can't get you guys to say them. So, at any rate, the first one is the statement: "There's no God but Allah. Muhammad is His messenger." Okay, that's the one that comes the closest to actual belief and the way that you get into Islam. But the other ones are carrying out the 5 prayers, the 5 daily prayers, to pay the charity tax, to fast Ramadan, and to make the Hajj pilgrimage. So all of those are actions. And they all require, to some extent, Islam being inside the public space. Okay, and that's the thing that really starts to bring Salafism to the core. As I said, the people who were starting off most Arab and Muslim countries in the 1950s and 1960s were essentially secular nationalists. They did not have a high value for Islam in the public space. And some of them actively despised Islam in the public space. Many of them had grown up or had been educated in European schools and so forth, and some of them were militant secularists. So the disappearance of Islam, I mean, we can't say complete disappearance of Islam, but definitely during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, there is a low point at which Islam is not primary inside the public space. And so Salafism, like so many different other Islamic trends, is basically trying to bring Islam back into the public space. Now, the manner in which it does it is much more coercive and dominating than any other forms of Islamism. In other words, there's definitely forms of Islamism in which Islam is being brought back, but not necessarily in an exclusionary or dominationist manner. Okay, those would be associated, for example, with the Muslim Brotherhood. But for Salafism, not only does Islam have to be in the public space, it has to be in an open and dominating manner in which it is obvious that Islam is the primary and maybe even exclusive belief system that is being associated with a given area. Now, in order to create those conditions, it seems obvious that there are significant numbers of apparent Muslims that are not, in fact, willing to join that ideal. So for Salafis, the answer for that is takfir, to claim that those people are not, in fact, Muslims. Okay, now I want to again stress the fact that this is a deviation to some extent from classical Sunnism. Okay, classical Sunnism in general was what we would call a big tent belief system. It did not emphasize witch hunts or heresy trials of the sort that you can find in Christian history. In general, if somebody prayed their 5 prayers, they pretty much were left alone. And so it's really not easy to see in classical Sunnism the sort of takfir that we have today. So Salafis, however, operate in a completely different manner. For them, it's extremely important to have boundaries and to make sure that the boundaries between Islam and non-Islam are very, very carefully maintained, and that anyone who steps beyond those boundaries is punished. Okay, so I guess I won't even bother to ask. The punishment usually for apostasy traditionally in mainstream Islam has been death. And so the adoption of the doctrine of takfir allows one to essentially apply violence towards your opponents quite freely. Okay, what Professor Erkan had said about the primary targets of these sort of tactics of being Muslim is in fact true. And we'll see that in a few more minutes. Okay, so Salafi Jihadism, the basic goal of it is to establish what they call a Sharia state. And some of you, again, might think, well, you know, I hear about Sharia. Sometimes Sharia is applied. There's definitely states that apply Sharia. We can think of a couple of examples, like Saudi Arabia, to give one. But for Salafi jihadis, it's very important to say that actually none of those examples are truly Muslim. Okay, because Salafi jihadism is a very purificationist trend. In other words, it focuses its violence and its polemic mostly against those Muslims to whom it's closest from an ideological point of view. And therefore, when you read their literature, you find these endless denunciations of Saudi Arabia or other different countries precisely because they do apply Sharia. From the Salafi point of view, they're frauds, and even worse, apostates. Okay, so they use these terms with a great deal of promiscuity, and so we'll just kind of start to familiarize you a little bit with their vocabulary. So the full application of Sharia is one of their goals. Now they have other different goals, and we'll talk about them just a little bit when we get to the issue of IS, the Islamic State. But one of those is pan-Islamism. In other words, the idea that all Muslims should be combined in one state. Excuse me. Sort of a mega Muslim state that would hypothetically encompass all of pretty much the area of the Middle East, South Asia, and so forth, Southeast Asia, etc. Okay, so another goal is to establish a caliphate. Okay, so that term caliph, some of you probably have heard of it. Means a legitimate successor to the Prophet Muhammad. Okay, now we can't afford ourselves to be detained into the question about who that person would likely be. Yes, please.
Could you repeat what it means?
It is the legitimate success, somebody who is seen as a legitimate successor to the Prophet Muhammad. Okay, so we can't get ourselves into the whole selection process at this particular time, but suffice it to say that the idea of a caliph and the importance of a caliph is quite significant to Sunni Islam. Okay, probably the most important tradition that's associated with that is the tradition that says whoever dies without swearing allegiance to the caliph of their time dies as a non-Muslim. Okay, now the last caliphs were actually removed by the regime, the Turkish regime of Kemal Atatürk in 1924. And there have been several different attempts by Muslims, worldwide Muslims, to reestablish caliphate inside the 1920s and 30s and so forth. But the attempt by the Islamic State recently in 2014 to reproclaim a caliph is probably the most unique and reasonably successful so far of that series of attempts. Okay, so those are just a few of their goals. They do have others, but those will have to suffice for this particular talk. Now let's go on to their methodology. Okay, now as I say, Salafism as a belief system does not necessarily imply violence. Okay, and I think that this is an important point to stress. That Salafis, there can be Salafis and Salafism which are known as quietist Salafis. Okay, that trend within Salafism usually represents something of withdrawal from society, but it's not unlike different other very religious groups that one can find, such as Orthodox Jews or very conservative Christians, and mainly they just keep to themselves. So, but that trend known as Salafi Jihadism has basically decided that they are going to be activists and try and apply violence in order to achieve the method of Salafism. Okay, so now what are those methodologies? So probably the most best known of all of those has to do with the use of suicide attacks. Now, it's not that suicide attacks don't have a history beyond Islam. Okay, so starting in the 1970s, 1980s, there's a number of groups, usually of a Marxist trend, that had used suicide attacks. The Tamil Tigers, for example, in Sri Lanka, had used suicide attacks to great effect, most obviously by the assassination of Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in 1991. But starting in the middle 1990s, there began to be full-scale use of suicide attacks by Salafi jihadis. Now, at first, that was confined to the area of Israel and Palestine. Okay, and in that sense, the use of suicide attacks garnered a great deal of support from the prominent religious authorities of that particular time. You can oftentimes find religious literature, religious rulings, which are known as fatwas. Okay, a fatwa is a solicited religious opinion about a given subject. In other words, you can ask a prominent figure, is this licit or is this not licit? And they'll give all the different reasons why, and so forth, and you have to follow that particular ruling. So from that period, you have about 80 to 85, perhaps I've collected about 84 different fatwas concerning the legitimacy of suicide attacks. And just to recap a couple of different problems right there. Traditionally, Islam had one of the most stringent prohibitions against committing suicide that you can find in any religious tradition coming out of the classical period. In other words, inside Islam, you have none of what we can call like the noble suicide. Okay, so if you want to find out what noble suicide looks like, you can read something like The Three Musketeers or The Count of Monte Cristo, or anything like that. You'll definitely see what that's like. There's nothing of that, historically speaking, inside Islam. Okay, coming into the contemporary period, usually Muslim countries had among the lowest suicide rates in the world. So the embrace of suicide attacks is by no means an obvious one. And it came with some resistance by various different prominent religious leaders who, especially those of a very conservative bent, who were never willing to accord it anything other than basically committing suicide. So, second point is the definition of what constitutes a suicide attack. Sometimes you can find some rather problematic definitions inside the literature. When I'm referring to a suicide attack, I'm referring to an attack by which the first victim is always the perpetrator. In other words, whatever happens, there is no way that the perpetrator can ever make it out alive. Their very action has to be to carry a bomb or to facilitate a blast in which they absolutely have to die. Okay, now this should be differentiated from different types of attacks that are suicidal in nature. Okay, so suicidal in nature attacks, it is definitely possible, maybe not always happening, but it's definitely possible for a person to actually survive such an attack. In other words, you can charge an enemy bastion that all the odds are against it, and somehow or another you still survive. You can find examples of that from various different wars and so forth. Somebody who, it seems like bullets just never touch them. But suicide attacks are completely different in nature. In other words, the perpetrator absolutely has to die in order to carry out the attack. Okay, so what we find is that there's broad acceptance of suicide attacks as long as they were focused very specifically against Israel, against Russia, and against India. Okay, so those are the three groups that were seen as being fundamentally illegitimate in their occupation of what were considered to be Muslim lands, okay, among the Palestinians, the Chechens, and the Kashmiris. And so throughout the 1990s, we do see quite a number of suicide attacks that are associated with those particular areas. But what was not noticed at that particular time is that a surprising number of those fatwas didn't actually confine the violence to those particular areas. In other words, it embraced the idea that suicide attacks, or what came to be called martyrdom operations, was actually the peak of jihad. In other words, to give up one's life in order to take other people's lives was considered to be the peak. So you have a huge amount of literature that enforces that idea, and it quickly bore fruit. And it was taken up most strongly by Salafi jihadis. So by the middle 1990s, more or less, all the groups that were non-Salafi jihadi had begun to abandon suicide attacks. The Tamil Tigers were first, Hezbollah was right after it, and various different Kurdish groups had also used suicide attacks and so forth. So, but all of those groups had put suicide attacks aside, and today we'd have to say that Salafi jihadis are basically, this is one of their signature operations. In other words, if you ever read about a suicide attack, you can pretty much bank on the idea that there's a Salafi jihadi behind it. Okay, so how does this tactic work, and why is it chosen as such a favorite? Okay, so the first thing that we should understand is that suicide attacks were originally programmed towards military operations. Okay, for example, when they were used by Hezbollah against Israel in South Lebanon, or against Russian soldiers in Chechnya, they were designed for military purposes. Okay, so at that time they were frequently called the poor man's bomb. However, what actually happened was very quickly most militaries pretty much were able to nullify the effects of suicide attacks. Okay, because it's perfectly possible if you're a military man to prepare yourself that simply nobody approaches you, or you're always in convoy, or you're very careful of who you associate with. Now, of course, there are exceptions. Some people do stupid things. Probably the most stupid was a couple of years ago when a group of CIA invited this guy who they didn't really know, who turned out to be a Jordanian double agent, and he wasn't searched very carefully, and so he blew himself up right in the middle of the CIA operation in Afghanistan and took a lot of people with him. So that was a classic example of stupidity, but it's actually virtually the only one. You can almost find no examples of, during the recent past, of suicide attacks really being an actual military operation. But there are other applications of it. So the next one that was most strongly developed by the Palestinians was in order to achieve some sort of leverage over, especially over negotiations, was to try and drive its opponent, which in that particular case was Israel, into a state of terror. Now, if you apply suicide attacks in a methodical manner, and you continue to send them in time after time, then they will do that to a society. Okay, so there's only a couple of societies that's actually been tested out on. Israel is one of them. Iraq is another one. Somalia also. Okay, but you can definitely drive a population into a completely catatonic state because simply nobody will trust anybody else. No one will go out into any public space or anything like that. Okay, so, but Israel quickly understood the answer to that, which was to build a security wall. And actually, during the last 10, 15 years, they haven't had any suicide attacks. Okay, so there actually are methodologies to deal with that. Aside from that, during the Algerian Civil War, actually there was a series of suicide attacks like that, where the Algerians were very careful to make sure that every single member of the martyr's family was killed, so that they knew that if they carried out a suicide attack, that their families would be killed down to the last person. So now that's a very barbaric tactic, but it did work, and it did stop suicide attacks at that particular time. So now other different types of suicide attacks have been to cause a society collapse. Okay, so probably the best illustration of that has been Iraq. Okay, so starting in 2003, there at the United States invasion of Iraq, which at that particular time there was a figure inside Iraq whose name was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. He was a small-time Jordanian petty thief criminal who had repented and been converted into Salafi Jihadism. So he had founded a small group which was known as the Tawhid wal Jihad, monotheism and jihad. And this formed a basis for what was later going to become the most powerful Salafi Jihadi movement inside Iraq, and eventually was the kernel that led to the foundation of Islamic State. So one of the things that Zarqawi saw inside Iraq is that hitherto, up to 2003, Iraq had been a state ruled by a smaller Sunni Muslim population ruling over a larger Shiite population. Now, Zarqawi, as a Sunni of Sunnis, believed that that was a natural thing. And what he wanted to do was to destroy the state as best he could in order to bring Sunnis into a state where they could actually take over the society again. In order to do that, he decided to start a religious war. And so suicide attacks began to multiply, especially against areas that were considered to be especially holy for Shiites. Okay, probably the best known of those was the first attack that he did in August of 2003, which was the largest non-airplane bomb that has ever been exploded in the Middle East, which was 4 huge truckloads of bombs that was set up against the Husseini Mosque in Najaf. Okay, so that's a very interesting operation, and it did manage to kill several thousand people and collapse the mosque itself. So this is a sort of operation that is basically designed to create horror, and it did. And any of you who know the recent history of Iraq will recognized as it slid into civil war during the period between 2004 and 2009. Okay, but at the self-same time, the critical weakness of Salafi jihadis also became apparent. This is a certain trajectory that we can oftentimes find with Salafi jihadis. Salafi jihadis usually will try and impose their version of Salafism upon a given society. Okay, and so that usually is such an extreme version of Islam that it will cause ultimately people to turn against that particular style of Islam. And so what happens is time after time in Algeria, in Egypt, in Mali, in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, Afghanistan, and so forth, whenever Salafis have been able to take over a given area, usually the population first welcomes them, but then they begin to impose their version of Islam on the society, and it's too much for people to bear. Okay, so how does that look in terms of the more recent Salafi jihadi groups, such as the Islamic State and Boko Haram? Okay, so just to recap, Islamic State is founded upon that kernel of people that is left over from the Zarqawi era. They go through a low point between 2009 and 2012, where they are almost wiped out because large numbers of Iraqis turned against them. Okay, that period is one in which the United States managed to marshal Sunnis to fight the Salafi jihadis because of the sort of things that the Salafi jihadis were pushing. And so, as the United States left Iraq in 2010, comparatively speaking, Iraq was in a good position. Unfortunately, the Shiite prime minister at that particular time chose not to maximize that good position, and within a short while, the Sunnis had actually returned back to being loyal to the Salafis. That was accorded to them by the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, okay, which started in 2011. By 2012, the kernel of what was going to become the Islamic State had moved over into parts of Syria and had amalgamated parts of that with Iraq. Okay, we can remember that one of the hallmarks of Salafi jihadism, especially in this type of manner, is that they want to get rid of borders. Okay, and so if you look at the pictures from that time, from 2013 especially, one of their favorite pictures is them dynamiting different border markers between Syria and Iraq. There shouldn't be that border. Both countries are Muslim from their point of view. Okay, so in 2014, certain structural weaknesses within the Iraqi army, namely the fact that large sections of the army didn't exist other than on paper because its officers were pocketing the money that was supposed to go to soldiers, revealed that the Islamic State could take over large sections of northern Iraq, which they did. So this is a very shocking moment in June of 2014, when all of a sudden, in one fell swoop, large sections of Iraq fell to the Islamic State. And in order to maximize that, the Islamic State unleashed a huge wave of terror operations in order to bring its opponents to its knees. Okay, so part of that was creating inside that state the ideal Sharia state. Okay, some of you, I hope maybe you've seen some of the videos and stuff like that. I can't recommend watching them, but if you do, you'll see people getting decapitated, usually gay people getting thrown off buildings, people having their hands cut off. It's pretty gory. So the Islamic State stands out in the recent past as really kind of a master of political and religious propaganda. There's been nothing like it inside Salafi jihadism known to me. The amount of videos that they put out and the sort of propaganda on Twitter, on all sorts of different social media and so forth is literally astounding. They had hundreds of people working for them and so forth to recruit from all over the world, and they got everybody. Okay, so if you guys, some of you might know the statistics from Belgium, but yeah, Belgium has the distinction of having the highest number per capita of Islamic State fighters. So yeah, but if it's any consolation, a lot came from the United States, a lot came from Trinidad. So there's a lot of different, different like places that they would come for. I just came from Singapore, and the Singaporeans were bemoaning that they had lost 44 to the Islamic State. So if even a state like Singapore, which is a control state, can have something like that happen, it's easy to see how other different places would be equally vulnerable. So getting back to Boko Haram. So Boko Haram is a phenomenon that I've been studying basically for the last 5 years. I had the unluck, or luck, depending on how you look at it, in 2009 of passing through their home just a few weeks before their uprising. They did an uprising in July of 2009. And so essentially ever since then I've been studying the group. So this is a group that has its roots in Nigeria, northeastern Nigeria, in a very strong rejection of contemporary education. It views education as basically being fundamentally illegitimate because it teaches things like Darwinism, various different interpretations that are contrary to an extremely strict and literalistic reading of the Quran. Okay, by extremely strict and literalistic, here I have to do a little digression. During the 1990s in Saudi Arabia, there's a certain phenomenon of Saudis who believed that if you believed that the earth orbited the sun, that you were a non-Muslim. And that the Quran emphasized that the sun orbited the earth. Now this is totally rejected by the vast majority of Muslims, but suffice it to say that it was accepted by Boko Haram. And the idea was that you should believe in these sort of things even if the science is heading you in a completely different direction, because that's what the Quran says. So yes, there's a very strong anti-educational side to Boko Haram. Now I should stress that that is not true of IS. In other words, IS was actually trying to build what we can call a modern state. It was a very Islamic state, and it was extremely cruel, but it was not fundamentally opposed to modernity. In other words, IS tried to create things like hospitals and the teaching of modern science. It did not say that the sun orbited the earth or anything like that. Okay, so there's something of a bad fit between Boko Haram and IS. So you should just be aware of that little tension right there. Okay, so starting in 2010, Boko Haram revives. Okay, most of its leaders had been in prison. They do a spectacular jailbreak in September of 2010 and begin to try and provoke a religious war inside Nigeria. So this is a time where Boko Haram's kind of trying to feel itself out, trying to decide what it should do with itself. It carries out a number of different spectacular attacks against Nigerian Christians, okay, usually on religious holidays. And then in the summer of 2011, it carries out its first suicide attack, actually against the United Nations headquarters in Abuja. I can't tell you the number of times before then, because I traveled in Nigeria quite a lot, that I'd heard from Nigerian Muslim leaders, no West African would ever carry out suicide attacks. Oh yeah, they never say that to me anymore. Sometimes I remind them that that's what they said. But since Boko Haram has carried out at least 700 suicide attacks since then, yeah, they don't really mention that anymore. Okay, so Boko Haram begins to take on the characteristics of an international Salafi Jihadi movement, starting especially in 2013 and 2014. So 2014 breaks with the first mass killing that they do, which is in the city of Baga in northeastern Nigeria. So they managed to take over this small city and kill off every single person in it, 2,000 some people. So this is basically to say, yeah, this group refused to swear, and so after that, then you always knew what would happen to those people who didn't swear. So then Boko Haram then follows this trajectory, which is very close to IS, but in some ways it also leads it. And in the spring of 2014, they revived the whole issue of sexual slavery. Okay, so this is something that they actually do prior to that of IS. So they're kidnapping of some 250 schoolgirls at Chibok. It's a turning point inside that group because it fulfills a lot of the group's sort of strategic needs. Okay, it attacks those schoolgirls when they are at school, taking their examinations, okay, and turns them into slaves, again, upending the sort of social order and forcing them back into what they would see as like a subordinate role. And so IS follows that almost immediately by their attacks upon the Yazidis and then upon the Christians of Iraq, taking women as sexual slaves and selling them in markets and so forth like that. You can see extensive material about it in a lot of different interviews with ex-slaves that are coming out now. So yeah, so Boko Haram begins then also actually to found itself a state, and in that fall of 2014 and spring of 15, the Nigerian army goes through a collapse, and actually a large section of northeastern Nigeria comes under the control of Boko Haram. So their trajectory since then has actually been on a downswing, but the group has continued to carry out suicide attacks, most stringently attacking those mosques and refugee camps. Okay, so again, you see the ideological nature of a group like Boko Haram in the choice of their attack target. Mosques, because for them, those people inside the mosques are worse than Christians from their point of view. They're apostate Muslims. They've had takfir proclaimed against them. And so Boko Haram, on a regular basis, will send suicide attackers to blow themselves up in the midst of praying Muslims. Okay, so yeah, so needless to say, tactics like that, I was most recently in Nigeria a couple of months ago, and just talking to people, I mean, first of all, the fear against Boko Haram is so huge, especially, because I hang out with academics and stuff. Academics are very subject to that. I mean, just every single one of them had a story of a friend who'd been killed, or sometimes they use the term squeezed, because oftentimes Boko Haram would go after academics to get money and so forth, or use various different blackmail tactics and everything. So, but the other thing that they target is refugee camps, and here again you have to take a look at their ideology in order to understand the reasons why. Because those refugee camps are filled with people who have fled the Boko Haram state. And for them, from the Boko Haram logic, those people are traitors. And they should they should be targeted. And so time and time again, you see that Boko Haram will attack these type of things. And some of them lead to really pathetic sort of things. It's like a couple of months ago, there's a story about this girl who was sent to this certain refugee camp, and she saw her father actually in it. And so she couldn't, even though her two friends blew themselves up inside the camp, she couldn't bring herself to do that. So there's a lot of different stories about things like that, and they're pretty heart-wrenching. So, just watching those sort of videos, it's really bad. I'll just tell you one that affected both myself and my graduate student when we watched it. because the Boko Haram people took these Nigerian Air Force officers hostage after their plane crashed, and this particular time they interviewed the officers, and then one of them tied the officer to a tree stump, and then he took an axe and he began to chop the guy to pieces, and it's all on video. I don't recommend watching it. My grad student told me he couldn't eat after that for 2 days, and I had to say I was like, it's really sick. So yeah, so these sort of videos are also all over online. You know, some of them periodically get banned and everything, but yeah, you can find them in you know, in these sort of things and stuff. And yeah, each one of them, they'll try and justify the things that they do. You know, like the Nigerian Air Force officers, for example, to say, well, you know, they were Muslims and they were attacking us, so therefore they're, you know, they're kafirs and everything. So, okay, so let's just kind of start to recap here. So the ideology of Salafi Jihadism is a very powerful attractant. Okay, some of you listening to, you know, my renditions of gory videos and stuff might think, what? I would never, you know, do anything like that. But the fact is that there's definitely a segment of the population that is attracted precisely by that. And if you can watch through that sort of stuff, then you're pretty much on the way to being willing to join the group. And it's amazing how many recruits they will find by desensitizing them through these sort of extremely brutal tactics that they'll video and then put online and stuff. So there's an attractant feature. Okay, so who do they attract? So we usually find that youngish student population is a strong attractant. Converts to Islam, okay, are frequently, you can frequently find them among the ranks of these sort of groups, especially like IS, okay, which views itself as an international Muslim organization. Identity people, okay, people that are craving an identity, okay, especially like second and third generation Muslims outside of a Muslim environment, sometimes not knowing that much about Islam. You know, sometimes are very open or willing to join up to these type of groups, okay, especially the sort of promises that they can hold out are promises that society can't really hold out. And you can see the attractant feature then, the use of sexual slavery, which is diabolical in its creation, but it worked. It did attract people. Another group that's oftentimes featured inside their attractants is criminals. Okay, so criminals oftentimes have the ability and skill set to carry out their types of operations that other people wouldn't necessarily know how to do. Because criminals would have access to, let's say, like forged passports, or have the ability to gather bomb-making materials and so forth, and sometimes have the necessary networks to carry things like that out. Okay, so Salafi Jihadism is right at the moment, both IS and Boko Haram are comparatively in a low position. Okay, IS basically since the fall of 2016 has been consistently attacked by its opponents in Iraq and the Kurds, and to some extent also by the Russians and the United States. Boko Haram has been attacked by pretty much everybody who it borders on, most especially the Nigerians and the Chadians. But there are still significant sections of those people who swore to IS all over the world, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, most especially now in the Philippines. There's definitely large sections that swore in Indonesia, and different pockets in Africa as well. So as I say, there's no particular place that's really particularly immune to this sort of thing. The FBI in the United States has said that they have investigations against IS open in every single state. And I can tell you from interviews pretty much in many countries in like the Caribbean, in Africa, and in South Asia, There's a lot of governments that are worried about IS and their ability to recruit in all sorts of different places and stuff. So, at any rate, but for the moment, their territorial basis is down. But I would like to emphasize that their caliph has not been caught as yet. So, I think that their group still has a future as long as he's around. So with that, I'd like to conclude.